The teacher's secret, 30 years of teaching, had prepared Mrs. Eleanor Johnson for many things. Difficult students, budget cuts, demanding parents, and endless paperwork. But nothing had prepared her for the moment when Steve Harvey would ask her a question that would expose the secret she'd been hiding for 3 decades. The Family Feud studio buzzed with its familiar energy. Golden lights bathed the iconic set in warmth, while the blue and orange logo gleamed like a promise of good fortune above the contestants' heads. Steve Harvey stood at his podium in an immaculate burgundy suit, his megawatt smile working the crowd with the natural charisma that had made him America's beloved game show host. It was a special episode, Teachers' Week, and both families were composed entirely of educators from across the country. On the left stood the Johnson family from Lincoln Elementary in rural Mississippi, and on the right, the Rodriguez family from Washington High School in Phoenix, Arizona. Mrs. Eleanor Johnson, 62 years old, with silver hair pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn to school every day for 30 years, stood at the end of her family's podium. She wore a simple navy dress, not because it was her favorite, but because it was one of only 3 dresses she owned that didn't show the wear of years of careful mending. To everyone watching, Eleanor looked like the picture of a dedicated educator, dignified, professional, with the kind of patient smile that had comforted thousands of children over the decades. What they couldn't see was the weight she carried, the secret that had defined every single day of her professional life. The Johnson family was representing more than just their school. They were representing Eleanor's entire world, the universe she had built around room 114 at Lincoln Elementary, where she had taught 2nd grade for 30 years without missing a single day. Standing beside her were her teaching colleagues, who had become her chosen family. Marcus Williams, the young 3rd grade teacher, who had become like a son to her. Sarah Beth Collins, the kindergarten teacher, whose infectious laugh could brighten anyone's day. James Montgomery, the retired principal who had hired Eleanor 3 decades ago and still stopped by the school every week. And Maria Santos, the special education teacher, whose compassion matched Eleanor's own. They had all driven 8 hours from Mississippi to Los Angeles, pooling their vacation days and scraping together money for gas and hotel rooms, because Eleanor had always talked about wanting to be on Family Feud. It was the one dream she'd ever expressed, the one thing she'd ever wanted that wasn't connected to her classroom or her students. What her colleagues didn't know was that Eleanor had applied to be on the show not for the fame or the excitement, but because the prize money could finally solve the problem that had been consuming her life for 30 years. Eleanor Johnson had been teaching for 3 decades, and for every single one of those years, she had been spending her own money to take care of her students. It had started small. In 1994, her first year teaching, she'd noticed that several children in her class came to school without lunch. Their families qualified for free meals, but the paperwork had gotten lost in bureaucracy, or parents were too proud to apply, or the process was too complicated for families who spoke limited English. Eleanor couldn't stand watching 7-year-olds try to concentrate on reading while their stomachs growled with hunger. So she started packing extra sandwiches, buying fruit from her own grocery budget, ensuring that no child in room 114 went hungry. It was supposed to be temporary, just until the lunch program paperwork got sorted out. 30 years later, she was still feeding children. As the years passed, Eleanor's secret mission had expanded. When she noticed children shivering in thin jackets during Mississippi winters, she started keeping a collection of coats in her classroom closet. When students couldn't afford school supplies, she made sure they had pencils, notebooks, and crayons. When families couldn't pay for field trips, Eleanor anonymously covered the costs. She bought shoes for children whose feet had outgrown their only pair. She purchased reading glasses for students who couldn't see the board, but whose families couldn't afford an eye exam. She kept a drawer full of clean clothes for children who came to school in dirty uniforms, and a cabinet stocked with soap, toothbrushes, and other hygiene supplies for families struggling to afford basic necessities. Every paycheck, Eleanor calculated her own bare minimum expenses, rent, utilities, groceries, gas, and spent everything else on her students. She drove a 2003 Honda Civic with 300,000 miles and a passenger door that only opened from the inside. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment that she'd rented for 15 years because moving would cost money that could otherwise buy winter coats for children. Eleanor had never married, never had children of her own, never taken a vacation that cost more than a tank of gas to visit her sister 2 states away. Her entire life had been built around the belief that education was the only way to break the cycle of poverty that trapped too many families in her rural community, and that sometimes caring for a child's basic needs was just as important as teaching them to read. The financial strain had intensified over the years. Teacher salaries in Mississippi were among the lowest in the nation, and funding for classroom supplies had been cut repeatedly. Meanwhile, the needs of Eleanor's students seemed to grow every year. More families struggling with unemployment, more children coming to school hungry, more basic necessities that somehow became Eleanor's responsibility because there was no one else to take it on. 3 years ago, Eleanor had been forced to take out a second mortgage on the small house she'd finally managed to buy after 25 years of renting. The money from the mortgage went directly into what she privately called her student fund, a checking account she used for all the supplies, food, clothing, and other necessities she provided for children in her classroom. Last year, she'd started selling her grandmother's jewelry, piece by piece, when the student fund ran low. The pearl necklace that had been in her family for 3 generations bought winter boots for 6 children, whose feet would have otherwise gotten frostbite walking to school in canvas sneakers. This year, Eleanor was behind on her mortgage payments. The bank had sent 2 warning letters, and she knew she had perhaps 3 months before they began foreclosure proceedings. She could have stopped spending her own money on students. She could have let children go hungry, go cold, go without. She could have prioritized her own financial security. But Eleanor Johnson had never learned how to watch a child in need and do nothing about it. The Family Feud application had arrived like divine intervention. The show was looking for inspiring teachers, and Eleanor's colleagues had nominated her, writing letters about her dedication, her impact on students, and her 30 years of perfect attendance. They had no idea they were also writing about a woman who had bankrupted herself trying to care for other people's children. Eleanor had applied because she hoped, prayed, that winning some money might finally allow her to save her house and continue helping her students, without choosing between her own survival and theirs. Now, standing on the bright stage with cameras rolling and an audience cheering, Eleanor felt like she was wearing a mask. She smiled when Steve Harvey made jokes. She celebrated when her team gave good answers. She played the part of the happy teacher living her dream. But inside, she was calculating. The grand prize was $20,000. After taxes, that might be enough to catch up on her mortgage and buy supplies for the next school year. It might buy her another year of being able to help children without losing her home. The game had progressed through the first 3 rounds with the Johnson family, maintaining a slight lead. Eleanor's colleagues were playing well, clearly energized by being on television and representing their profession on a national stage. Steve Harvey was in his element, making jokes about the unique challenges of teaching and creating warm moments of connection with both families. During the introductions, he'd spent extra time talking to Eleanor, clearly charmed by her gentle dignity and the obvious respect her colleagues had for her. "Mrs. Johnson," he'd said, 30 years in the same classroom. "That's not just a career, that's a calling." Eleanor had smiled and thanked him, but something in her expression, a flicker of deep tiredness behind her kind eyes, had caught Steve's attention. There was more to this woman's story than the cheerful exterior suggested. Now, as they entered the 4th round, Steve announced the category that would change everything. "All right, Johnson family," Steve said, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had endeared him to millions of viewers. "This is a special one for you teachers. Top 7 answers on the board." The studio lights seemed to intensify as Steve opened his card, and Eleanor felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She'd been having trouble sleeping lately, worrying about the mortgage, about how she was going to help her students next year if she lost her house, about what would happen to children who depended on her if she couldn't be there for them anymore. We asked 100 people, Steve announced. What's something a teacher might secretly do for their students? It was such an innocent question, such a logical, Family Feud question for Teachers Week. The kind of thing that should have generated answers like stay late to help them, or buy extra supplies or give them encouragement. The kind of question that should have celebrated the extra mile that good teachers go for their students. But for Eleanor Johnson, it was like being asked to confess her life's work in front of millions of strangers. Marcus stepped up to the buzzer first, his young face bright with confidence. Stay after school to tutor them, he announced. Stay after school to tutor them, Steve repeated. Good answer. Survey says. The board lit up. Number 2 answer, worth 24 points. The Johnson family cheered, and Eleanor forced herself to smile and clap along with them. Sarah Beth went next. Buy them school supplies with their own money, she called out, and Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. Buy school supplies, Steve said. Survey says, number 4 on the board, 18 points. Another celebration from the Johnson family. Another forced smile from Eleanor. James added, give them extra credit when they're struggling. Number 6, 8. Maria guessed, bring in snacks for the class. Number 5, 12 points. They were doing incredibly well. They had control of the board and a commanding lead. All they needed was a few more answers to secure victory. It should have been a moment of triumph for the teachers from Lincoln Elementary. But as each answer appeared on the board, Eleanor felt like the walls were closing in around her. Each response was a variation of the life she'd been living in secret for 30 years. And now it was her turn to answer, with cameras rolling and millions of people watching, including colleagues who had no idea how far their quiet, dignified friend had gone to help the children they all cared about. Eleanor, Steve said, approaching her at the end of the podium. Something in his voice was different now, gentler, more personal. Mrs. Johnson, 30 years of teaching. I bet you've got some stories. Eleanor looked up at Steve Harvey, and for a moment, the game show host saw something that stopped him cold. It was exhaustion. Not the tired after a long day kind of exhaustion, but the bone-deep weariness of someone who had been carrying an impossible load for far too long. What's something a teacher might secretly do for their students? Steve asked gently. Eleanor stared at the board, but the words were blurring together. In her mind, she could see 30 years of faces, children who had depended on her, families who had trusted her, little hands that had reached for help that only she could provide. She thought about Jamie Peterson, who had come to school in the same torn shirt for a week until Eleanor quietly left a bag of new clothes in his desk. She thought about Maria Gonzalez, who had cried because she couldn't afford the reading glasses she needed until Eleanor arranged for an anonymous donor to pay for her eye exam. She thought about the Thompson twins, whose mother had worked 3 jobs but still couldn't afford winter coats for both children. She thought about her house, the foreclosure notices, the grandmother's jewelry she'd sold, the life she'd never lived because she'd been too busy making sure other people's children had what they needed to succeed. Take care of them like they're your own, Eleanor said quietly, her voice barely audible over the studio's ambient noise. Steve's expression shifted. He'd been expecting a typical answer, something that would keep the energy up and the game moving. But something in Eleanor's tone, something in the way she delivered that response, made him pause. Take care of them like they're your own, Steve repeated slowly. Survey says, the answer appeared on the board, number 1, worth 32 points. The Johnson family should have erupted in celebration. They'd just secured their victory, practically guaranteeing their place in the final round. Instead, something in Eleanor's posture, something in the tremor of her voice, made everyone pause. Steve found himself walking closer to Eleanor, abandoning his usual position behind the podium. Mrs. Johnson, he said softly, when you say, take care of them like they're your own, what exactly do you mean? That's when 30 years of carefully guarded secrets began to crumble. Eleanor looked up at Steve Harvey, and the mask she'd been wearing for 3 decades began to slip. Her eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for years, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of every sacrifice she'd ever made. I've spent my entire life making sure no child in my classroom goes hungry, goes cold, goes without, she said, her voice breaking. I've bought their food, their clothes, their school supplies, their medicine. I've paid for their field trips, and their glasses and their shoes. I've spent every penny I've ever had, and some I didn't have, because I couldn't stand to watch a child suffer when I had the power to help them. The studio didn't go silent immediately. The audience was still processing what they'd heard. The Rodriguez family was still standing at their podium, and the cameras were capturing what seemed like an emotional but routine moment of teacher dedication. But Steve Harvey had been doing this long enough to recognize when someone was confessing more than just professional dedication. He could see the pain behind Eleanor's words, could hear the financial desperation that no teacher should ever have to carry. "Mrs. Johnson," Steve said gently, "are you telling me you've been spending your own money to take care of your students' basic needs?" Eleanor nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "For how long?" Steve asked. 30 years, Eleanor whispered. "Every day for 30 years. The admission hung in the air like a prayer. Steve felt something shift in his chest. Not just sympathy, but the kind of deep respect that comes from recognizing true heroism when you see it. "Hold on," Steve said, raising his hand to signal the production team. "Hold on just a minute here." The studio began to quiet. The Rodriguez family stopped conferring about their potential answers. Even the cameramen seemed to sense that something unprecedented was happening. Steve set down his cards and walked to Eleanor, standing directly in front of her. When he spoke, his voice had lost all traces of performance. This was no longer Steve Harvey the entertainer. This was Steve Harvey the human being, recognizing another human being who had given everything she had to serve others. "Eleanor," he said softly, "I need you to help me understand something. You've been teaching for 30 years, spending your own money to make sure children have what they need. How much of your own money are we talking about?" Eleanor looked around the studio, suddenly aware that she was about to reveal the secret she'd guarded for 3 decades. But something about Steve's expression, the complete absence of judgment, the genuine care in his eyes, made her feel safe enough to tell the truth. "Everything," she said simply. "I've spent everything. My house is in foreclosure. Because I can't stop buying food for hungry children and clothes for kids who don't have enough. I sleep on a mattress on the floor because I sold my bedroom furniture to pay for winter coats. I haven't bought myself new clothes in 5 years because that money went to children who needed school supplies." The confession poured out like water through a broken dam. "I drive a car with 300,000 miles because I can't afford a car payment when children need lunch money. I sold my grandmother's jewelry to buy books for my classroom library. I took out a second mortgage on my house to pay for a student's medical expenses when his family couldn't afford the prescription he needed for his asthma." Steve's expression had completely transformed. Behind him, Eleanor's colleagues were staring in shock, finally understanding the depth of their friend's sacrifice. "And I'd do it all again," Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger. "Because these children don't choose to be born into poverty. They don't choose to have parents who can't afford basic necessities. But they deserve to learn. They deserve to feel cared for. They deserve to know that someone believes they're worth investing in." Behind the scenes, producers were frantically whispering into their headsets. But Steve wasn't listening to them. He wasn't thinking about schedules or ratings or television protocols. He was looking at a woman who had literally given her life to serve others, and he was trying to process the magnitude of her sacrifice. "Mrs. Johnson," Steve said, his voice thick with emotion, "what you're describing isn't just teaching. That's mothering. That's parenting hundreds of children who aren't even your own." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. "And you're telling me that after 30 years of this, you're about to lose your house?" Another nod. More tears. Steve Harvey turned to address the entire studio, his voice carrying a gravity that transcended entertainment. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I want everyone in this studio, and everyone watching at home, understand what we're witnessing here. This woman has spent her entire adult life bankrupting herself to make sure other people's children have what they need to succeed in school." The audience began to stir, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. "This isn't just about being a good teacher," Steve continued. "This is about someone who has sacrificed everything, her financial security, her personal comfort, her own future, because she couldn't stand to watch children suffer when she had the power to help them." Steve walked back to Eleanor and placed his hands on her shoulders. "Eleanor," he said, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. What you've done for 30 years isn't normal. It's not expected. It's not required. What you've done is saintly." He turned to address the cameras directly. "We talk a lot in this country about heroes. We celebrate athletes and entertainers and politicians. But a real hero is standing right here. A woman who has spent 30 years proving that love is an action, not just a feeling." Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. "Mrs. Johnson, I want you to give me the name and number of your mortgage company. Right now. We're going to call them live on television, and make sure you don't lose your house." Eleanor's eyes widened in shock. "Mr. Harvey, you couldn't possibly continue to sacrifice your own security for children who aren't even your biological family?" Steve interrupted gently. "Because you've been doing exactly that for 30 years. Now it's time for someone to take care of you." The call to the mortgage company took less than 10 minutes. Steve, using his celebrity status and the power of live television, spoke directly to a supervisor who agreed to work with Eleanor on a payment plan and assured her that her house would not go into foreclosure. But Steve wasn't finished. "Eleanor," he said, "I want you to know that what happened here today is going to change things for you. But more than that, it's going to change things for a lot of people who are watching." He gestured to the audience, many of whom were openly crying. "Because you've just reminded all of us what it looks like when someone chooses to love without limits, to do without counting the cost, to serve without expecting recognition." Steve turned to the production team. "We're going to do something different today. Both families are winners. But more than that, we're going to make sure that Mrs. Eleanor Johnson never has to choose between helping her students and keeping her own home again." The episode aired exactly as it happened, with minimal editing. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The show received over 300,000 messages from viewers, and within 48 hours, a GoFundMe campaign started by former students had raised over $500,000 for Eleanor's student fund. Major school supply companies reached out to donate materials for her classroom. A local car dealership gifted her a reliable vehicle. Publishers sent boxes of new books for her classroom library. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from other teachers around the country who began sharing their own stories of personal sacrifice for their students. Eleanor's confession had given them permission to talk about the hidden costs of caring for children in underfunded schools. Eleanor returned to Lincoln Elementary the following Monday, as she had every day for 30 years. But for the first time in 3 decades, she didn't have to choose between helping her students and paying her own bills. Marcus, Sarah Beth, James, and Maria set up a formal support system to help Eleanor manage the donations and ensure that her generosity would be sustainable for years to come. Steve Harvey kept his promise too. He established an annual Eleanor Johnson Teaching Excellence Award that provides financial support to teachers who go above and beyond for their students. 6 months later, Eleanor received a letter from a former student named David Patterson, now a successful engineer in California. He wrote, "Miss Johnson, I just saw you on Family Feud and I want you to know that I am who I am today because 30 years ago, you made sure I had lunch every day, helped my family get me glasses when I couldn't see the board, and convinced me that I was smart enough to succeed. You saved my life, and I never got the chance to thank you properly." The letter was one of hundreds that arrived from former students who had finally learned the source of the anonymous help they'd received in second grade. Eleanor framed David's letter and hung it in room 114, where it serves as a daily reminder that love multiplied always returns to the giver, often in ways they never expect. Today, Eleanor Johnson continues teaching at Lincoln Elementary. She still arrives early and stays late. She still cares for her students with the fierce devotion that has defined her career. But now she does it with the knowledge that her sacrifice has been seen, honored, and supported by people who understand that education is about more than just teaching children to read and write. It's about teaching them that they are worthy of love, investment, and care. Lessons that Eleanor Johnson has been providing, one child at a time, for 30 years. The question that revealed Eleanor's secret, what's something a teacher might secretly do for their students, turned out to have an answer that no survey could have predicted. Sometimes a teacher gives everything she has because she understands that for some children, school isn't just where they learn, it's where they discover that someone believes they're worth saving. And sometimes when a teacher's love is finally witnessed by the world responds by making sure that love can continue without destroying the person who gives it. That's what happened the day Eleanor Johnson stopped keeping secrets and started accepting the help she'd been giving others for 30 years. The disclaimer: this content is a dramatized narrative created for educational and inspirational purposes. While inspired by real challenges faced by teachers in underfunded schools and the personal sacrifices many educators make for their students, the specific events and dialogue are fictional. The story is designed to entertain, inspire, and encourage appreciation for the teaching profession. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental.